Well, hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Sam, and I am a student of the Bible and of theology, and I am a pastor. I've been a pastor for 22 years, and my training involves biblical studies, theology, and biblical languages. We are going to jump into a new series. We're done with Genesis, and we're going to jump into the book of James in the New Testament. So I want to read you James 1:1, and then we're going to jump into authorship. We're going to jump into the dating of the book. We're going to jump into what was going on in the historical context. We're going to look at some of the critical scholarship surrounding these issues, and then we're going to look at some of the rebuttal of the critical scholarship and even some of the traditional views of this authorship of this book, and try to see what's going on here, what makes most sense. I'll give you my opinion on what I think, and then we'll hit the ground running in the book of James, and we'll kind of see how all of that plays into what's being written here. So James 1:1, it actually reads this way in Greek. It's Iakobos Theou kai kuriou is Jesu Christou doulos tes dodeka phules tes in ti diaspora kerin. Okay, and that means James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, blessings or greetings. So James starts out that way. So right off the bat, we get a declared author. We get a declared people that he is writing to, and then we get a setting. A time setting for us. Okay, so James, who's James? Well, James, traditionally, it's been viewed that this James is actually James, the brother of Jesus, or the half brother of Jesus, who was a skeptical of his, older brother growing up, and then eventually comes to realize who his brother Jesus is, and then he ends up becoming the overseer of the church in Jerusalem. We find that out in the book of Acts. And makes some pretty big decisions. He ends up getting martyred in 62 CE. And so that's the traditional view, that this is that James that's writing. And there's, like I said, that's kind of who he is, what's going on there. The traditional dating of this book would be somewhere in the 50s, 60s-ish. But that's debated in critical scholarship. And the people who he is writing to is also kind of questioned in critical scholarship. But the traditional reading is that these are Jewish people who have accepted Jesus as their Messiah, scattered all over the place in Israel and all over, and he's writing to them. Now, the critical look at this, the critical scholarship surrounding this would say this. It would say that that no one really knows who wrote the book of James. In fact, it's attributed to James, but they would say that's highly, they're very skeptical of that. That's highly unlikely. And there's a bunch of different reasons that they would give for that. I'm going to give you 3 of those reasons. Okay, number 1 is because the Greek in the book of James seems advanced. And they're saying, well, James, growing up in Galilee, this Galilean, he took over the church in Jerusalem, but he would not have been that advanced in the Greek language as, someone else would have been later on. And so they would say, well, the book of James could not have been written by James. He would not have been able to write in this kind of Greek. The second reason that they would say it's not written by James is because the church fathers in the early, 2nd century, 3rd century, they don't really mention the book of James much. They say there's not a lot of anything going on about the book of James. And if there is, it's not really positively talked about. They would even say that Jerome in the 4th century, 5th century, something like that, would have been he said something to the effect of that he knew a source that told him that the book of James was actually written by somebody else under James's name. Okay, and so that's kind of the critical scholarship there that would have say, no one really knows who it is. It's likely someone using James's name, maybe who knew of James or who knew of the writings of James or some stuff here and there, compiled together and put this letter together. The third reason that the critical scholars would say that this is likely not James is because they would say, well, it seems that James's letter is correcting some of Paul's theology in Galatians and Romans, when he would say, it's faith and works. It's not by works of the law, but by faith only. And James is James seems to be correcting that, going, no, it's by, it's not just by faith. I'll show you my faith by my works and that kind of stuff. So he would be correcting that. Well, Paul didn't write Galatians and Romans till later, and so it's like, well, he can't be here because if this is James, he was martyred in 62, so we can't have him writing after 62, so it wouldn't be James. And so they would place the writing of James somewhere in the late first century, early to mid second century, maybe even later than that. Now, that's some of the critical scholarship here, but there is not agreement amongst critical scholars even on these points. There's a lot of disagreement on this, and there are a lot of biblical scholars who actually push back on that and say, well, no, all of these points are just kind of little blippy data points. They don't really make a great argument for us to say, no, James isn't the author. In fact, the Greek being advanced, they would say, well, there's a lot of people who are writing advanced Greek during that time period that were Jewish. And so that's not really a good argument against James writing this book. In fact, James may have used a scribe who was very advanced in the Greek language. And, he dictates what he kind of wants the scribe to write, and the scribe writes it in advanced Greek and sends it along. So that, it's not they would say that's not a great argument as to, well, this can't be James because of that. The church fathers' silence is probably also not a great argument. An argument from silence equals that's why we're not going to attribute it to him. And then the whole idea of Jerome, Jerome lived in 400s CE, so way removed beyond when any of this would have been written. And saying, I know a guy who knew something about this is kind of like conjecture, right? And so the pushback is pretty decent. It's like, I don't know, so the actual evidence that they would use to say, hey, I'm not sure that these data points equal that James didn't write it, is the level of the knowledge of Judaism, Second Temple Judaism in the book of James is astounding, actually. The understanding of what was going on during the 50s in Jerusalem with the famine and all this kind of stuff as to why people were poor, why rich people would have treated poor people, terribly, what was going on with persecution during this time period. There's quite a few books that I would point you to that have this in it. Let me look this up real quick. First, one of the books that I'm looking in, so to get the critical stuff, I've been looking in the critical authorship. You look in the New Oxford Annotated Bible. N.T. Wright writes a little bit of the critical stuff in his book, The New Testament and Its Times, but he also writes a rebuttal to it in there, him and Michael F. Bird. And then I looked up a couple different articles about the book of James. But the pushback is significant on this. Wright pushes back in his book. Michael Bird pushes back. Scott McKnight, who's a biblical scholar, he pushes back. There's another Bible scholar named Karen H. Jobs. She wrote a book called Letters to the Church, a survey of Hebrews and the general epistles. And she writes in her book a significant pushback as to, well, whoever wrote the book of James was heavily familiar with what was going on in Second Temple Judaism, was heavily familiar with what was going on during the time period of the 50s with the famine, and knew what was going on in early Christianity. And her take is that this book was likely written earlier. And so when you start putting some of all this together, what was this dispersion that was being talked about here? Well, it was likely the dispersion that's talked about in Acts chapter 8. All of these different authors argue for that Acts chapter 8 provides this dispersion where the Christians in Jerusalem are scattered all over the place because of heavy persecution. And James is their leader. He is the overseer over the church in Jerusalem. And so he's writing this letter, or having a scribe write this letter to his church that's dispersed all over the area because they are afraid and they're under heavy persecution. And now there's a famine going on. And so he's writing to them and talking to them about what it means to have faith in Jesus. And what this ends up highlighting for us in James is a sneak peek and a look into what early Christianity and what the early Christian theology looked like. And it's likely that what's going on here in the book of James is these Jewish people who have accepted Jesus as their Messiah, but still living out in a very Jewish way their faith. And so this is what is going on in the book of James. In fact, some people have even written that what's going on here leads to, and what James writes, and the theology that was believed early on in the church in Jerusalem led to the Judaizers who end up going up to Antioch and taking a very law-based version of Christianity to the church in Antioch and saying, no, you have to follow the law, you have to be circumcised, which causes Paul to have a sharp dispute with them and Barnabas, and then they end up going down to Jerusalem and having a big conversation about this whole thing, and then that becomes the Jerusalem Council, and then the letter gets written. The other thing that they would say is that the letter that's written in Acts 15 by James, or dictated by James to be written, is very close. The Greek is very close to the letter that would be written here in James. Now, the touch point there is like, well, Luke, if he's the one who wrote it, is very attuned to Greek, so he knows what's going on there. So that may be why that's high Greek in the book of Acts. But this whole idea of what's going on in the book of James is likely that this is a sneak peek into early Christianity with Jewish people who have accepted Jesus as their Messiah and are now trying to figure out what it looks like to live out this Christian life. And James, as their leader in Jerusalem, doing that pre-Jerusalem Council. And then once the Jerusalem Council happens, they realize that, oh, maybe this isn't going to work for the Gentiles, and so we need to come up with a better way of viewing this. And so they're led to stripping all of the law back to these 4 commands that are left. They write this letter, and then Paul takes that and runs with it to the rest of the churches and spreads across Europe. And so what we may have going on here is we may have a very early sneak peek into what early Christianity looked like in the church in Jerusalem. And so I think that actually explains a lot more, and that later on the book of Galatians is written. So maybe James is actually the very first book that's written in the New Testament, and then the book of Galatians is written, and then later on the book of Romans is written. And that's why you have these differing ideas about Abraham and what it means to have faith versus faith and works and all that kind of stuff. And Galatians and Romans means to be more of a corrective of the early theology that ended up turning into this circumcision thing. And then Paul is coming back going, no, now we've decided at the Jerusalem Council, now we need to correct this theology that's going rogue. So that could be it. I think there is a lot of strong argument there as to maybe that's what's going on in this book, and it helps make sense of a lot of things that are actually written in the book of James if we take that all into consideration. Otherwise, if we have to take a later date and it's not James, it's just people using some of the thoughts that James may have written down and kind of putting it together and compiling it and using it as a corrective of Paul, it doesn't make sense what's going on here. And it doesn't make sense why the church fathers would kind of go, well, we don't need to do that. In fact, what you see is the church fathers mainly ignoring James and running after Paul's works a lot, which would make more sense if James was an earlier version of Christianity that was more Jewish in its nature, and that what we have by the 2nd and 3rd century is more of Paul's influence on Christianity and a post-Jerusalem Council influenced Christianity that was more Gentile in its nature, sweeping through Europe. So that is kind of a big setup into where we're going to go in this book. Personally, I operate with this when it comes to authorship and dating and all that kind of stuff. I operate under the idea that if a book presents itself as being authored by somebody, and I'm not talking about the title of like the letter of James or the Gospel of Matthew, I'm talking about like it says James right at the front of the thing. I don't usually doubt that. I'm not skeptical of that or critical of that unless something within the thing tells me we need to like question it or be critical of it. Sometimes when you're reading through like 1st and 2nd Timothy, you start to go, this doesn't sound a lot. It sounds kind of like Paul, but there's stuff in here that's very different than what Paul has mentioned before, said before, and it makes you kind of question some of those things. James really doesn't give us anything really to question here. It doesn't really kind of stand out and go, wow, that doesn't sound like James. And actually what it does is that sounds a lot like maybe what early Christianity and early Christian theology sounded like pre-Council of Jerusalem. So I don't usually call into question that kind of stuff unless there's good reason to call that into question and to really kind of wrestle through that. I'm not going to just be skeptical just because I want to be skeptical, kind of a deal. And I think that's kind of the point of some of these authors and their pushback is like, we don't need to be skeptical of things that don't really lend themselves to be skeptical. So we should question things and ask good questions and really track down data points and stuff. But when there are good data points to be had on both sides, we really need to wrestle with all of that. And I think that's why there's not just a big consensus that, oh, James didn't write this kind of a thing. There's a wrestling with it and kind of going, well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, kind of a deal. With all that in mind, we're going to jump into James chapter 1 in the next video. I just wanted to set the context for James here in this one. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Hopefully this is going to be a fun study through the book of James. Like the video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.